My mother was buried on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my brother had already changed the locks on her house. I found out when I drove over to water her plants. Because someone had to, because she loved those plants. Because 3 days after lowering my mother into the ground, I was still doing the small things she would have wanted done, and my key didn't work. I stood on her porch with my key in my hand, and I thought, they didn't even wait. They didn't even wait a full day. My name is Anna. Anna Grace Whitfield, though most people have just called me Anna my whole life. 30 years old, the youngest of 3 children born to Margaret and Joseph Whitfield of Clover Hill, Tennessee. A town small enough that everyone knows your family name, and large enough that you can still be invisible inside it if you know how. My mother's name was Margaret, but nobody called her that. Everyone called her Maggie. Maggie Whitfield was the kind of woman who made things grow. Not just the plants on her porch, though those were legendary in our neighborhood, cascading green and flowering things that made her front steps look like the entrance to somewhere sacred. She made people grow. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like the best version of yourself was not some distant aspiration, but something already present, just waiting to be seen. She was 63 years old when she died. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed 14 months before the end, fought with everything she had, and ultimately surrendered to on a quiet Tuesday morning in October with the window open and the curtains moving and my hand in hers. I was there. My brother and sister were not. That detail matters. Hold it. Let me tell you about my family. My brother's name is Robert. He's 38. The oldest. Robert became, after our father died 11 years ago, the person who believed he was the head of the family. Not because anyone elected him, not because he earned it, but because he was the man, and in his mind that settled it. Robert is not cruel in an obvious way. He's the kind of man who wraps his cruelty in the language of practicality. He says things like, "That's just reality, and someone has to make the hard calls," and he says them in a tone that implies the someone is always him and the rest of us should be grateful. He married a woman named Karen 6 years ago. Karen is, and I say this as a person who has tried very hard to be fair, the sharpest edge of Robert's worst qualities. She sharpened him. Or maybe she just helped him stop hiding what was already there. I'm not sure which is worse. My sister's name is Diane. She's 35. Diane and I were close once. Close the way sisters are when they're young and the world is small, and the distance between beds in a shared room is the whole universe. But Diane married a man named Phil who had opinions about everything, including which members of his wife's family were worth her time. And over the years, Diane had gradually, quietly, chosen Phil's opinions over her own. I watched it happen. I never fully understood it. And I grieved it the way you grieve something that's lost so slowly there's no single moment you can point to. Just a long diminishment, and then one day you realize the thing is gone. Then there was me, the youngest, the one who never moved away from Clover Hill. I stayed not because I had no options. I have a nursing degree, I could have gone anywhere. But because Mama got sick and I looked at the situation and I made a choice. I reduced my hours at the hospital. I moved back into the house I grew up in. I became the person who drove her to chemotherapy, who sat with her through the bad nights, who learned which foods she could tolerate in the last months and which smells made the nausea worse. I became her person. And here's the thing about becoming someone's person when they're dying. It's the most complete and devastating love you can give. You are fully present for the hardest thing. You hold them through it. You witness every part of it. And it costs you something, not something you regret, but something you can never get back. Robert visited 4 times in 14 months. Diane visited 6 times. They sent money occasionally, which I want to be fair about. They did send money. For certain bills, certain medications. They were not absent in every sense. But they were absent in the sense that mattered most. And my mother noticed. My mother noticed everything. 3 months before she died, Mama had a good week. That happened sometimes in the later stages. A window would open, the pain would recede slightly, the fog would lift, and she would be sharply, fully herself for a few days. Those windows were gifts. You learned not to waste them. During that week, she asked me to help her with some paperwork. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had helped me with homework, where she had rolled out pie crusts at Thanksgiving, where our family had eaten 10,000 meals. And she spread out documents and she walked me through them. Her will, her accounts, her wishes. She was careful and methodical and completely clear-minded. She told me where every document was kept. She told me what she wanted for the house, for her jewelry, for the small savings account she had maintained since before my father died. And then she told me something she asked me to keep between us. For now, she said, "Anna, I've made some changes. Some of what I've done might surprise your brother and sister. I need you to trust me that I had reasons. And I need you to promise me that when the time comes, you won't let them bully you out of it." I looked at her. I said, "Mama, what did you do?" She smiled. That specific smile she had, small and warm and knowing. She said, "I took care of you, the way you've taken care of me. Now promise me." I promised. I had no idea what I was promising. I found out later. But first, the locks changed, and everything that came after. I drove to Robert's house the morning I found my key didn't work. He lived 12 minutes from Mama's. He'd bought a house in the newer development on the east side of town, a place with a homeowners association and a 2-car garage and a kitchen Karen had renovated twice because the first renovation wasn't quite right. I knocked on the door. Karen answered. She had the expression she always wore around me, a smile that was technically present but contained no warmth whatsoever. Like a window display, you can see through it to the emptiness behind. She said, "Anna, we weren't expecting you." I said, "I went to Mama's house. My key doesn't work." A pause. Fractional. The kind that happens when someone has been expecting a conversation and is deciding how to begin it. She said, "Robert had the locks changed yesterday. Come in." I came in. Robert was in the kitchen. He was on the phone, and he held up one finger when I walked in. The gesture that said, "Wait, I'm busy. You are secondary." And finished his call, while I stood in his kitchen and breathed carefully. When he hung up, he turned and looked at me with the expression I knew as his managing things face. It was the face of a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to go and was waiting for the other person to catch up. He said, "We need to talk about the house." I said, "Yes, we do." Why was my key not working? "We changed the locks for security. It's been 2 days since the funeral, Robert. Things need to be handled promptly. The estate has to go through probate. Until it does, the property needs to be secured." He said all of this the way he said most things, with the tone of a person explaining something obvious to someone slow. And I felt what I always felt in his presence, the simultaneous pull toward deference and the deep, quiet resistance to it that had always lived underneath. I said, "I had personal items there. I was staying there. You can arrange a time to collect your things." I looked at him. I said, "Arrange a time." "Yes. With me or Karen. We'll make sure you have access." What he was describing was my mother's house, where I had lived for the past 8 months caring for her, being treated as though I were a visitor applying for entry. I breathed. I said, "What about the will?" Robert's expression shifted, just slightly. "We're handling it," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means Diane and I are coordinating with an attorney. We'll let you know what everything comes to." Karen was at the counter doing something with the coffee maker, deliberately peripheral. I said, "I'd like to be part of that process." Robert looked at me with something that was almost pity. That brand of pity that is really condescension wearing a softer coat. He said, "Anna, you're 20 years younger than me. You've been living in Mama's house because you didn't have a stable place of your own. We appreciate everything you did for her. We do. But the legal and financial aspects of the estate need people who understand these things. People who understand these things. I have a nursing degree. I have been managing medication schedules, insurance claims, end-of-life paperwork, and medical communications for 14 months. But I don't understand things. I nodded. I said, "Okay," and I left. I sat in my car in Robert's driveway for 4 minutes. I want to be honest about those 4 minutes, because part of me, a significant part, a part built from 30 years of being the youngest, the quietest, the one who accommodated, wanted to accept what he'd said, wanted to believe that he knew better, wanted to take the path of least resistance, which was to grieve quietly and let them handle things and trust that family, even imperfect family, would ultimately be fair. That part of me was very loud in those 4 minutes. And then I thought of Mama's face at the kitchen table, her voice. "I need you to promise me that when the time comes, you won't let them bully you out of it." I started the car. I drove to the one place she had told me to go. Her name was Patricia Hendren. She had been my mother's attorney for 22 years. She was in her late 60s, silver-haired, unhurried, with the particular confidence of a woman who has spent decades being underestimated in a profession that tried to exclude her and has long since stopped finding it interesting. She had an office above a dry cleaner on Main Street that looked like nothing from the outside and contained, I discovered, a woman who had been keeping my mother's secrets very carefully for a very long time. I called her the day after my visit to Robert's house. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Mrs. Hendren, this is Anna Whitfield, Margaret Whitfield's daughter." She said, "Anna, I've been expecting your call. How soon can you come in?" There are conversations that reorganize your understanding of everything that came before them. This was one of those. I sat across from Patricia Hendren in her office, a room full of organized paper and the particular smell of books and old wood and serious work. And she folded her hands on the desk, and she told me things that my mother had not fully told me at the kitchen table. Things my mother had done in the 14 months of her illness. Let me start with what I knew. I knew Mama had a will. I knew she owned the house on Clover Hill Road, the house where we grew up, the house worth conservatively $320,000. I knew she had a savings account. I knew she had some jewelry, including her mother's ring, which she had always said she wanted me to have. Here is what I did not know. 3 years before her diagnosis, 3 years before any of us knew she was sick, my mother had quietly, carefully, restructured several assets. The house on Clover Hill Road had been placed in a revocable living trust, with me as the primary beneficiary, revisable while she was alive, irrevocable upon her death. The trust had passed to me the moment she took her last breath. The house was already mine. Robert had changed the locks on a house that legally, from the moment our mother died, belonged to me. Patricia Hendren told me this with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting to say it and was choosing her words deliberately. Then she told me the rest. The savings account, approximately $62,000, had been divided in the will, 40% to Robert, 40% to Diane, and 20% to a local hospice charity that had provided support during Mama's final weeks. Note what was missing from that division. Me. I was not included in the savings account distribution. Because I didn't need to be. Because my mother had already taken care of me 3 years ago. Through the trust, through the house, through a document that didn't go through probate and didn't require Robert's cooperation and couldn't be contested the way a simple will could be contested. She had been planning this. Quietly, years in advance, she had built a structure that protected me, the child who had stayed, who had shown up, who had held her hand, in a way that was legally ironclad and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. I sat in Patricia Hendren's office and I felt the floor shift under my feet. Not from shock, exactly. From recognition. From the understanding of what my mother had been doing at that kitchen table 3 months ago. She hadn't been explaining her will to me. She had been telling me what she'd already done. She had built the thing and then shown it to me. Because she was Maggie Whitfield, and she didn't wait for the world to get around to protecting the people she loved. She did it herself. And she did it right. Patricia Hendren looked at me across that desk and she said, "Your mother came to me 9 months before she got sick. She said," and I'm quoting because she was very specific, she said, "Patricia, I have 3 children and I love them equally, but I know which one will be here at the end. And I want to make sure that the one who stays isn't punished for staying." I couldn't speak for a moment. Patricia continued, "The trust was established legally, properly witnessed and notarized, with no possibility of challenge on the grounds of competency since it was created 3 years before her diagnosis. The transfer happened automatically at the moment of her death. There is no probate process for the house because it never went through her estate. It passed directly to you." I said, "Does Robert know?" Patricia's expression told me the answer before she spoke. "Robert contacted my office 2 days ago. He was under the impression that he and Diane would be managing the estate and asked me to transfer all of Margaret's documentation to an attorney he was retaining." A pause. "I told him that as Margaret's attorney of record, I had obligations to the estate and to Margaret's specific instructions, and that I would be in contact with all 3 beneficiaries in due time." I said, "He didn't ask about a trust?" "He didn't know to ask." I sat with that. Robert had gone straight to managing the estate, assuming the straightforward path of probate, assuming the house would go through the will, assuming that as the oldest he would be in the position of authority, without knowing that the most significant asset had already moved, without knowing that the ground he was standing on wasn't his. Patricia Hendren leaned forward slightly. She said, "Anna, I want to prepare you for something. When your brother and sister find out about the trust, they may contest it. They may claim undue influence, that you manipulated your mother into changing her estate plan. It's a common challenge in situations like this, particularly where one child provided primary caregiving." I said, "Can they win?" "Not easily. The trust was established years before the caregiving began, which is the strongest possible protection against that argument. Your mother was also documented by her own physician as fully competent at the time it was created. And I have," she paused, opened a folder, "documentation of her intentions in her own words. A letter she wrote and left with me to be read in the event of exactly this kind of dispute." A letter. My mother had written a letter. For me. For this moment. Because she had known that they would challenge it. Patricia gave me a copy of the letter to take home. I read it in my car, in the parking lot above the dry cleaner on Main Street, with the windows fogged from my breathing and the October light going thin and gray. I'm not going to read you every word of it. Some things are too personal to share fully, and this is one of them. But I will tell you what she said at the end. She wrote, "Anna, you stayed. Not because you had to, not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you are the kind of person who shows up all the way when people need you most. I learned that from watching you, and I am prouder of that than I know how to say. The house is yours. I want you to know that it was always going to be yours. The moment I understood what staying truly costs, I knew. Don't be angry at your brother and sister for too long. Anger is a weight, and you've carried enough. But don't let them take what I built for you. Stand up. You've earned the right. All my love, forever." Mama, I sat in that parking lot for a long time. Robert called me that evening. He had, I assumed, spoken again with his attorney, who had spoken with Patricia Hendren, who had, in her careful and professional way, begun the process of communicating the existence of the trust. He called 3 times before I answered. When I picked up, his voice had a quality I had never heard from him before. Controlled, but tight, like something being held under pressure. He said, "Anna, we need to talk about something." I said, "Okay." "Patricia Hendren says there's a trust." "Yes, the house is in a trust." Yes. A pause. Did you know about this? And here is where I made a choice. I could have said yes. I could have told him that Mama had told me at the kitchen table, that I had known since 3 months before she died. But I thought about the locks. I thought about arrange a time with me or Karen. I thought about you don't understand these things. I said, I found out when I spoke to Patricia. Which was technically true. I had found out the full scope of it when I spoke to Patricia. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You need to understand that this doesn't look right. An old woman, terminally ill, her youngest daughter living in her house. People are going to ask questions about influence. I breathed. I said, Robert, the trust was created 3 years before Mama was diagnosed. Silence. 3 years, I said. Before any of us knew she was sick, before I moved back, before any of the caregiving. She did this on her own, in her right mind, with her attorney, years ago. More silence. Then, I'm going to have my attorney look at this. I said, That's your right. And I hung up. My hands were shaking when I put the phone down. I want to tell you that, because I don't want you to think I was calm and confident and certain through all of this. I wasn't. I was terrified. Not of Robert, exactly, but of the version of this where I won legally and lost everything else. Where the family I had grown up in, already fractured, already diminished, shattered completely. Where I held the house and lost my sister. Where I won the battle and the cost was the last connections to the people who shared my blood and my childhood, and the memory of our mother's voice. That fear was real, and it sat in my chest like a stone for weeks. Robert retained an estate litigation attorney named Warren Cole. Warren Cole was 60 years old and had the particular swagger of a man who had spent decades winning by overwhelming smaller opponents with paperwork and posturing. He sent a letter to Patricia Hendren's office within a week. A formal letter, dense with legal language, contesting the validity of the trust on the grounds of undue influence and questioning my mother's capacity. Patricia called me after she received it. She read me several sections, and then she said, Anna, I want to be very clear with you about something. I said, Tell me. Mr. Cole is experienced, and he is going to be aggressive. The undue influence argument won't succeed. I'm confident of that, given the timeline. But this process is going to be uncomfortable. They may depose you. They may bring in people to testify about your relationship with your mother. They may try to characterize your caregiving as manipulation. I said, My caregiving. I know what it was, and we can document what it was. But I want you to be prepared for how it will be framed. I thought about 14 months, about chemotherapy appointments and midnight fevers and the particular loneliness of sitting in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. waiting for results. I thought about them calling that manipulation. And the anger that came was clean and cold and useful. I said, Patricia, what do we need? She said, everything. Medical records, pharmacy records, any communications, texts, emails, between you and your mother during that period, visitor logs from the oncology clinic if they're available, your mother's doctors, anyone who witnessed the nature of your relationship. I said, I have 14 months of text messages. She said, start there. Here is what I had. 1,247 text messages between me and my mother from the time of her diagnosis to approximately 3 weeks before her death, when she could no longer reliably hold her phone. They were, in retrospect, a documentary of everything. Appointment reminders I had sent her, and her responses. Grocery lists, medication schedules, the messages she sent me at 2 a.m. when the pain was bad, and she didn't want to wake me but needed to know someone was there. My responses. Always. Always. I responded. The messages after good days. The messages after hard days. The small dailiness of it. The love inside the dailiness. I had pharmacy records. Every prescription I had filled for her, with dates and dosages. I had mileage logs I had kept for her insurance reimbursements. Every drive to the oncology clinic, every hospital trip, every pharmacy run. I had, because I am a nurse and this is how I am trained, kept a care journal. Daily entries, medical in nature, documenting her symptoms and medications and responses to treatment. I had started it because it helped her doctors. I had kept it because the structure of it gave me something to hold on to in a period when most things felt like they were dissolving. That journal was, Patricia told me when I brought her a copy, one of the most comprehensive pieces of evidence of dedicated caregiving she had seen in 22 years of estate law. And then there was something I hadn't planned for, something I hadn't known existed. It came from Rosa. Rosa Chen had been Mama's oncology nurse for the last 8 months of her treatment. She was 40-something, efficient, no nonsense, with a gift for making terrible situations feel survivable. Mama had loved her. They had developed a relationship. Not friendship exactly, but something adjacent. The particular bond that forms between a patient and the person managing their suffering. Rosa called me about 3 weeks into the legal proceedings. She said, "Anna, I heard there's a dispute about your mother's estate. Small towns. Everyone hears everything." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to know something. Your mother talked about you. A lot. Every appointment, almost. She would talk about what you had done that week, what you had made for dinner, how you had handled something difficult. She was so proud of you." I held the phone very still. Rosa said, "She also said something once that I've been thinking about since I heard about the dispute." She said, it was about 6 months before she passed. She said, "My youngest one gave up her life to take care of me, and I am going to make sure that when I'm gone, that sacrifice is honored. I've already seen to it." I said, "Rosa, would you be willing to put that in writing?" She said, "I already did. I sent it to Patricia Hendren's office yesterday." My sister called me in week 3. Diane. She called on a Sunday evening, which felt deliberate. Sunday evenings have a softness that makes hard conversations easier to begin. Her voice was different from Robert's, less tight, more tired. She said, "Anna, how are you?" I said, "I'm okay. How are you?" A pause. She said, "This is a mess." I didn't answer. She said, He's very angry. He feels blindsided." I said, "He changed the locks on a house that isn't his, one day after the funeral." Silence. "I know," she said quietly. That quiet was significant. It was different from the silences Robert left. Those were the silences of someone reorganizing for the next argument. This silence had something in it that felt like acknowledgement. I said, "Diane, what do you actually want from me?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I want my family back." And here is where it got complicated. Because underneath all of it, underneath the locks and the attorneys and the trust and Robert's entitlement, was the thing I had been grieving much longer than my mother. My sister. My sister, who I had been losing for years, piece by piece, to a version of herself that Phil had gradually persuaded her into. And here she was on the phone, on a Sunday evening, sounding like the Diane I remembered. Tired and honest, and not entirely sure how she'd gotten to where she was. I said, "I don't want to fight either. But Diane, I can't give up what Mama left me. She made those choices for reasons. She was protecting something." A long pause. She said, "I know." Then, "Phil thinks we should side with Robert. That we'd split whatever Robert gets after the trust is addressed." I said, "The trust isn't addressable. The timeline is airtight." Another pause. She said very quietly, "I know that too. I looked it up." And there it was. Diane had already done her own research. She already knew. Which meant her call was not about the legal fight. Her call was about something else. I said, "What do you need from me, Diane?" She said, "I need to know you won't hate me." That sentence. From my sister. I felt something crack open in my chest. Not painfully. Painfully might have been easier. This was more tender than that. More vulnerable. I said, "I don't hate you. I never could." She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded like something held for a long time being released. She said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there more. For Mama. For you." I said, "I know." She knew too, didn't she? It wasn't a question. I said, "She knew. She also loved you. Fully. Always." We were both quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to talk to Phil about not joining Robert's legal action." I didn't say anything. She said, "I can't promise he'll agree, but I'm going to say it." And here is the moment I have thought about most when I look back at this whole experience. I was standing in Mama's kitchen, my kitchen, now, legally, holding my phone, looking at her plants on the windowsill that I had been watering every day since she died, and my sister was telling me she was going to try. And I thought, this is what she meant. Mama, at the kitchen table, don't be angry at your brother and sister for too long. Anger is a weight. She wasn't asking me to accept what they'd done. She was asking me not to let the anger be the last word. I said, "Diane, come visit. Come here, come see the house." A pause. She said, "Yeah? Yeah, whenever you're ready." Diane withdrew from the legal action 12 days later. Phil was not happy, but Diane, and I credit her for this more than she may know, held her ground. She withdrew. That left Robert and Warren Cole. And Warren Cole, it became clear in the weeks that followed, had begun to realize what he was working with. Patricia told me in our fourth meeting that Cole's depositions of the medical team had not gone the way he anticipated. Dr. Okafor, Mama's oncologist, had been quietly devastating on the subject of my caregiving and my mother's cognitive clarity. Rosa Chen's written statement had been admitted as a supporting document. The care journal, my daily entries, clinical and specific, had been submitted in full. And then there was the piece Patricia had been holding. The document I hadn't known about until she mentioned it in our second meeting, and which she had saved deliberately, strategically, for the right moment. It was a handwritten letter from my mother, dated 2 months before she died, addressed to Patricia and designated for submission in the event of a legal dispute. It was not the letter she had left for me. This one was different. This one was addressed, formally and specifically, to whoever challenged the trust. Patricia read me selected portions in her office. Mama had written, in her careful, deliberate handwriting, "If you are reading this, it means someone has decided to challenge the trust I established for my daughter Anna. I want to be clear about the following things. I made this decision in full possession of my mind and my will, 3 years before I knew I was ill. I made it because I understood, even then, which of my children would be present at the difficult moments. I made it without being asked, without being pressured, and without regret. If my daughter Anna is being challenged in this matter, she is being challenged by people who are hoping that her silence is the same as her surrender. It is not. It never was. Please ensure that she knows I said so." Patricia looked up from the letter. She said, "Anna, I think we're ready." The mediation was set for a Thursday in February. Robert came with Warren Cole. I came with Patricia Hendren, and I brought something else. In the weeks before the mediation, Patricia and I had assembled what she called the complete picture. Every document, every record, every piece of the care journal, Rosa's letter, the oncologist's deposition, the pharmacy records, the mileage logs, the text messages, not all 1,200, but a curated selection, printed and organized, that told the story of 14 months in clear and specific terms, and Mama's letter to Patricia, which had not yet been formally submitted in the legal proceedings. Warren Cole did not know about it. I knew he didn't know about it, because Patricia had held it deliberately, waiting for the right moment, the way you hold a final card. The mediation room was beige and fluorescent and utterly without personality, which is, I think, deliberate. A neutral space, a place without history, where things can be decided without the weight of any particular room pressing down on them. Robert sat across the table from me. He looked tired. He also looked, for the first time I could remember in a very long time, uncertain. Warren Cole had clearly communicated to him how the evidence was trending. Robert had come in expecting to overpower a quiet, grieving younger sister who didn't understand things. He was now sitting across from a woman who had submitted, through her attorney, 14 months of documented caregiving so thorough it had made his own expert witness visibly uncomfortable in deposition. The mediator opened the session. Cole made his argument, condensed, more muted than I expected. The timeline of the trust, it was clear, had already undermined his central case. He pivoted to secondary arguments, that the distribution was unequal, that Robert and Diane's contributions to the family over the years deserved consideration, that there were questions about assets that hadn't been addressed. Patricia listened to all of it without expression. Then she said, "I'd like to submit a document." She slid Mama's letter across the table. Cole picked it up. Read it. His expression didn't change. He was too experienced for that. But something shifted behind his eyes. He passed it to Robert. Robert read it slowly. I watched his face. I had prepared myself for anger, for him to put the letter down and reassemble his argument, for him to say something dismissive and strategic. I had not prepared for what actually happened. He read it, and then he read it again. And something in his face, something underneath the years of performance, underneath the entitlement and the certainty and the locks changed 24 hours after the funeral. Something gave way. Not completely, but enough. The mediation did not resolve in a single session. I want to be honest about that, because life is not a courtroom drama where everything lands cleanly in one room. It took 2 sessions. In the first, Robert's attorney maintained the legal challenge but reduced its scope significantly after Mama's letter was submitted. In the interval between sessions, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Robert called me, not his attorney. Robert. He called on a Wednesday night. Late. He said, "I read the letter again." I said, "Okay." A silence. He said, "She knew I wasn't there." I didn't answer. He said, "She still left me 40% of the account. She still mentioned me in the will. He stopped. I waited. He said, "I thought I had more time. With her." I kept thinking, after this deal closes, after this quarter, after the kids' school stuff settles down, I'll go. I'll spend real time there. I kept putting it off. I said, "I know." I didn't think. His voice caught. Just briefly. I didn't think she'd be gone in 14 months. And here is the moment I need to tell you about. Because in that moment, on that phone call, on a Wednesday night in February, I had a choice. I could have let him feel it alone. I could have said something that acknowledged his guilt and left him in it. I could have been cold, and I would have been justified. But I thought of Mama. Don't be angry at your brother and sister for too long. I said, "Robert, she knew you loved her. She said so to me. She understood who you were. She also made her decisions based on the full picture. But she never stopped loving you. Not for one moment." A long silence. He said, "Why are you telling me that?" I said, "Because it's true. And because you're my brother." The second mediation session lasted 4 hours. Warren Cole was quieter than the first time. At the end of it, Robert withdrew the legal challenge. He did not get the house. He received his 40% of the savings account, as the will specified. So did Diane. The hospice charity received their 20%. And the house where Mama had grown her cascading green plants and rolled out pie crusts, and helped with homework and loved her children with everything she had, the house passed to me. Fully. Legally. Finally. I moved back in on a Saturday in March. Diane came to help. She brought boxes and coffee, and her youngest, a 7-year-old named Sophie, who had never spent much time at Grandma Maggie's house, and who walked through every room with the particular wonder of a child encountering a new world. We spent the day unpacking and reorganizing and talking, really talking, the way Diane and I used to talk when we were young, and the distance between our beds was the whole universe. We talked about Mama, we talked about Phil, about Robert, about the years that had passed and the shape they had taken. We talked about things we had both been avoiding for a long time. It was not a resolution in a single day. That's not how families work, but it was a beginning. At the end of the afternoon, Sophie found Mama's plants on the porch and asked me their names. I didn't know all of them, but I knew some. I told her the ones I knew. She got her grandmother's notebook, a small spiral thing Mama had kept for her plants, with each one labeled in her careful handwriting, and she showed me the rest. We sat on the porch steps, that 7-year-old and we named every plant together. And it felt, in a way I cannot fully articulate, like something being passed down, like a thread, continuing. Robert called me one more time, about a month later. He called to tell me he and Karen were doing some work on their house, renovating the kitchen. Again. He said it as small talk, as an offering of normalcy. I talked to him for 20 minutes about kitchen renovations. That might not sound like much, but in my family, in the context of everything, it was significant. It was the first time in years Robert had called me with nothing to manage, nothing to dispute, nothing to control. He just called. I don't know what the future looks like for us. I don't know if Robert will ever fully understand what he did in those first days. The locks, the dismissal, the assumption that I was someone who didn't understand things. But I know that Mama understood something Robert hadn't yet learned. That showing up fully costs something, and that the ones who pay that cost are worth protecting. She protected me, before she got sick, before anyone knew she was sick, before I even knew I would be the one to stay. She looked at the future with clear eyes, and she built something that would hold me when the worst came. That's the kind of love that doesn't end when the person does. It outlives them. It lives in documents and letters and handwritten plant journals, and the particular way light comes through a kitchen window in the house where someone loved you as completely as they knew how. The plants on the porch are doing well. I'm not as naturally gifted with them as Mama was, but I'm learning. Sophie comes over on Saturday mornings sometimes, and we check on them together and write in the notebook. I've been thinking about going back to full hours at the hospital. I've been thinking about a lot of things. What I know is this. I have a house that my mother built for me before I knew I would need it. I have a sister I am carefully, slowly rebuilding something with. I have a brother who is complicated and imperfect, and still, on some fundamental level, mine. And I have a care journal with 14 months of entries, clinical and specific and full of love in every careful documented line, that I will keep for the rest of my life. Not for evidence, just because it's the story of the most important thing I ever did. And I never want to forget a single day of it. Let me tell you the last thing. The morning after I moved back in, I woke up early, before it was fully light. I went downstairs in the quiet house, made coffee, and took it out to the porch. I sat in the chair where Mama used to sit, the same chair with the same slight tilt to the right from years of use. I sat and I watched the street come slowly alive. A car, a dog walker, the sky going from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of an early spring morning in Tennessee. And I thought about what she had written, "The house is yours. I want you to know that it was always going to be yours." The moment I understood what staying truly costs, I knew. I understood something in that moment that I had not fully understood before. She hadn't left me the house as a reward. She hadn't left me the house to punish Robert and Diane. She had left me the house because she knew, with the clear, unsentimentalized love of a woman who saw her children truly, she knew that I would take care of it. The way she had taken care of it, The way she had taken care of all of us, in her quiet, methodical, ahead-of-the-curve way. She left it to me because she trusted me with it. And there is no greater thing one person can give another than their trust. I sat on that porch and I breathed the morning air. And I talked to her. I told her it was going to be okay. I told her the plants were fine. I told her Sophie was learning their names. And I told her something I had said to her 1,000 times in 14 months. In hospital corridors and at kitchen tables and in the quiet of 2 a.m. when the fear was large and the world was small. I'm right here, Mama. I'm right here. She already knew. She always knew. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it reminded you of someone you've lost, or a fight you're in the middle of, or a love you're still carrying, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you're someone who showed up for a person when it was hard, when it cost you something, when no one else was there, this story is for you. You are not invisible. What you did mattered. It will always have mattered. Subscribe if you want to stay with me. I'll be here. And remember, sometimes the person everyone assumes won't fight back is the person who's already won. They just haven't shown their hand yet.